When Mark and Vanessa Holloway purchased the grand, ivy-clad estate in Encino, California, they had no idea of the house's past. They were not die-hard music fans, nor did they follow celebrity gossip. To them, the house was simply a dream home, spacious, with a sprawling garden and a history that stretched back decades. It wasn't until the realtor offhandedly mentioned, this was once Tito Jackson's house, that Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "Wait, that Tito Jackson?" she asked. "The one and only," the realtor chuckled. "He lived here until his passing a few years ago. The Jackson family visited often. This place has stories." The Holloways weren't the superstitious type, so the thought of moving into a house where a famous musician had died didn't trouble them. If anything, it was a cool conversation starter. But they soon learned that Tito Jackson's presence hadn't entirely left the building. It began subtly, barely noticeable. Vanessa often worked late, alone in the house while Mark was at business meetings. One evening, as she sat in the dimly lit living room with a glass of wine, she heard it. A soft strumming. She turned her head, listening. It was faint, distant, like a guitar being played from another room. She assumed it was the neighbor's music seeping through the walls. But when she stood and walked toward the sound, it stopped abruptly. The next night, it happened again. She told Mark, but he laughed it off. "Babe, this is LA, someone's always playing music." But then the other things started happening. Mark first experienced it in the hallway leading to the master bedroom. No matter how warm the house was, there was always one inexplicably cold spot. A stretch of hallway where the temperature plummeted the moment you stepped into it. He brushed it off at first, but it nagged at him. One night, Vanessa woke up to find Mark sitting upright in bed, pale and breathing heavily. "What's wrong?" she whispered. He swallowed. "I swear to God. I just saw someone standing in the doorway." She turned quickly. The doorway was empty. But the next morning, when they reviewed the security camera footage from the hallway, they both felt sick. A faint, shadowy figure stood in the cold spot for several seconds before vanishing. Determined to get to the bottom of things, Mark did some research. The house had been Tito Jackson's refuge, the place where he played music privately, away from the public eye. Even in his later years, after his brothers had passed or drifted apart, he was known to sit alone for hours, strumming his guitar in the attic. Mark had barely been in the attic since they moved in. It was mostly storage space, cluttered with old furniture and boxes. But after Vanessa heard the music again, this time unmistakably coming from upstairs, he decided to investigate. The attic door creaked as he pushed it open. The air smelled stale, tinged with dust and something older, something more electric. He stepped inside, his breath forming a cloud in the unnatural chill. And then he saw it. A guitar, sitting upright against the wall, as if waiting for its owner to return. It wasn't theirs. They had never brought a guitar into this house. Mark reached out to touch it, but the moment his fingers brushed the strings, the sound of footsteps behind him, he spun around, heart pounding. No one was there. They called in a paranormal investigator, not fully expecting answers but desperate for validation. The woman who arrived was calm, professional, and carried an air of quiet authority. She walked the house, pausing in certain areas, whispering under her breath. When she reached the attic, she closed her eyes. "He's still here," she said. Vanessa's breath hitched. "Tito," the investigator nodded. "He loved this house. He played music here, felt peace here. He's not trapped, just lingering, watching." The Holloways never felt threatened. If anything, they grew accustomed to the occasional soft strum of a guitar late at night, the faintest echo of a song that had yet to be finished. And so they let him stay. Even in death, Tito Jackson's music lived on. The attic became a room they both avoided but never spoke about. It was not a place of terror, nor did it feel malevolent, but there was something unnerving about it. The air was always heavier up there, as if carrying the weight of all the years spent in silence. The whispered melodies woven into the wood and fabric of forgotten things. Vanessa found herself lingering at the bottom of the attic stairs some evenings, her fingers tracing the railing absent-mindedly. She would listen, tilting her head slightly, waiting for some proof that she had not imagined the soft, wandering chords that seemed to drift down to her when the house was otherwise still. It was never a full song, just fragments, a few notes, a ghost of rhythm, a whisper of melody that never resolved. Mark refused to acknowledge it. He buried himself in work, in phone calls, in late-night drinks that turned into early morning headaches. But there were moments, even for him, when the house pressed in too close, when the cold spot in the hallway seemed to stretch further, creeping toward their bedroom, seeping into the fabric of their sheets. He never spoke about the night he woke up gasping, feeling the unmistakable pressure of fingers brushing against his shoulder. They told themselves they were being dramatic. It was an old house. Old houses had drafts, strange acoustics, wooden beams that creaked and settled like weary bones shifting in sleep. But then the record player started turning on by itself. At first, it was always the same song, one of Tito's own, an instrumental track he had recorded late in his career. A song neither of them had ever heard before moving in, but one that became as familiar to them as their own breathing. It would start quietly, a soft hum of static before the needle settled, and then the low, honeyed sound of a guitar would fill the living room. It played at odd hours, early in the morning when Vanessa was making coffee, late at night when Mark was watching TV alone, once even in the middle of the afternoon while they were both in the backyard. They checked the player. It was old, yes, but in perfect condition. The needle didn't stick, the turntable wasn't faulty. And yet, whenever they tried to play another record, it wouldn't work. Only that one ever played. Only when the house wanted it to. The night the humming began was the night Vanessa truly believed. She had been half asleep, caught in that strange, in-between place where dreams and waking thoughts tangled together. The room was dark, the world outside quiet. She shifted under the sheets, feeling the warmth of Mark beside her. And then, a low, slow hum, soft, almost thoughtful. It was coming from the corner of the room. Her breath hitched. She turned her head just slightly, just enough to glance toward the shadows pooling near the bedroom door. The cold spot was there. And the humming. It wasn't the mindless, tuneless hum of a faulty pipe or distant traffic. It had shape, rhythm. It was a melody, a human sound. She reached out, fingers finding Mark's arm, squeezing tight enough to make him stir. The humming stopped. The cold faded. And the house fell silent again. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. She didn't tell Mark. But she knew, without doubt, that they were no longer just living in this house. They were sharing it. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The house had begun to breathe with them. It was not an oppressive presence, nor did it feel hostile, but it was constant, woven into the fabric of their daily lives, whispering in the walls, lingering in the corners of their vision. The house did not demand attention, but it made itself known in ways too subtle to ignore. Vanessa began to notice the scent first. It would appear suddenly and without reason, filling the air with something rich and nostalgic. The deep, warm musk of aged wood and leather, mingled with the faintest trace of something sweeter, cigars, perhaps, or the memory of old cologne clinging to a jacket long after its owner had walked away. She would catch it in the hallway near the cold spot, or drifting through the kitchen in the early evening hours, as if someone had just passed by, lingering for a moment before vanishing. Once, late at night, she smelled it in their bedroom. She had been sitting up in bed reading, Mark already asleep beside her, when the scent enveloped her, not faint this time, but full-bodied and undeniable, as though someone had just sat down at the edge of the bed. She froze, her eyes darting to the space at her feet, but the room remained empty. She waited, heartbeat steady but quick, fingers curled tightly around the edge of her book. The scent faded slowly, dissipating like smoke in the wind. She didn't wake Mark. She only closed the book, turned off the light, and lay awake for hours, listening to the silence. Mark refused to talk about it. Whenever she brought it up, the music, the scent, the cold, he would shake his head, scoff, deflect. "It's just an old house," he would say, voice clipped, eyes darting away. But Vanessa saw the way he had started leaving lights on when he walked through the hallway at night. She saw how he hesitated at the foot of the attic stairs, how he had stopped going up there entirely. One night, When she came home late from dinner with friends, she found him in the living room, staring at the record player with his jaw set tight. It was playing again. The same song. Soft, low, winding its way through the air like a half-forgotten lullaby. Mark stood beside it, motionless, his fingers hovering over the needle as if debating whether to stop it. She stepped forward, and the floor creaked beneath her. Mark flinched. The music stopped. The silence between them stretched too long. Vanessa exhaled slowly. "You hear it too?" Mark rubbed a hand down his face, let out a sharp breath. "I don't know what I hear," but he did. She could see it in his eyes. It happened 3 weeks later. Vanessa had been in the garden, trimming the overgrown rose bushes near the back patio, when something in the attic window caught her eye. A shape, faint, blurred by the glass, but unmistakable, someone standing there, watching her. She sucked in a sharp breath, her body going rigid, pruning shears still clutched in her hand. The figure didn't move, didn't shift, didn't fade, didn't flicker like a trick of the light. It stood there, still and silent, and even from a distance, she could feel the weight of its attention, the quiet, watchful presence pressing against her skin. She forced herself to move, to blink, to turn toward the house as if shifting perspective would make it disappear. But it was still there. For the first time since moving in, Vanessa felt something close to fear. Not terror, not dread, just a quiet, bone-deep understanding that whatever was in this house was no longer content to exist unseen. She backed away, slow and careful, her breath coming in shallow gulps. The shears trembled in her hands. When she reached the back door, she turned back one last time. The window was empty, but the cold spot in the hallway felt closer that night. Closer than it had ever been. As though something had finally decided to step forward. That night, after the encounter in the garden, Vanessa found herself unable to shake the feeling that the house was changing. She had always been a pragmatic person, and the things she had felt and seen over the past few months were beginning to pull at the edges of her reality, challenging everything she thought she knew about her world. She lay in bed beside Mark, his steady breathing filling the silence between them, but she couldn't rest. Every creak in the house seemed amplified, every gust of wind louder than before. It was as though the walls themselves were speaking in a language only she could understand. Her eyes moved slowly over the room, past the shadowed corners, lingering on the space where the door to the hallway stood ajar. There it was again, the faintest shift in the air, a coldness she couldn't explain. It was not the normal chill of the night creeping through the window, but something deeper, something more personal, as if the house itself was exhaling slowly, deliberately, waiting for her to acknowledge it. She finally turned her head toward the hallway, her gaze falling on the faint outline of the attic door at the far end of the corridor. The door that had remained mostly untouched for weeks now, but one that she knew, deep down, would never stay closed forever. The door creaked. It was barely perceptible, the sound so soft it could have been mistaken for a trick of the mind, but Vanessa's heart leapt anyway. She held her breath. The house had always been old, settling with the weight of time, but this felt different. This felt intentional. The door was slowly opening, its wooden frame giving way as if someone were pushing it from the other side. Mark stirred beside her, murmuring in his sleep, his hand brushing against her arm, but Vanessa couldn't move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the door, which was now wide enough for her to see into the darkness of the attic. And there, in that blackness, she saw it. A figure, a shadow standing at the farthest edge of the attic, framed by the opening like a silhouette. The figure was unmoving, still, its presence too solid to be dismissed as an illusion. It was not a person, at least not one she could recognize. The figure seemed to merge with the shadows themselves, its edges blurred, as if it had always been part of the house, part of the very fabric that held it together. Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to call out to Mark, to shake him awake, but her voice refused to form words. She felt paralyzed, trapped in the moment, as if the air itself was thickening around her, suffocating her. The figure in the attic didn't move, but she could feel its gaze, heavy and deliberate, focused entirely on her. It was as if the house had taken on a life of its own, as if it knew she had seen it for what it truly was. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure dissolved back into the shadows, leaving nothing but the dim glow of moonlight spilling across the floor. The attic door creaked shut, as if someone had reached out and pulled it back into place, sealing whatever had been there inside. Vanessa blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of what she had seen. She reached for Mark's hand, clutching it tightly, but the room was suffocating now, too small, too stifling. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She wanted to believe it was a trick of her mind, a figment of her imagination born from the stress of living in a house so steeped in history. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. She had felt that presence before, a whisper, a faint vibration of energy, but tonight it had been undeniable. The house had shown itself to her, and in doing so, had crossed a line there was no going back now. She lay still, listening to Mark's soft breathing beside her. But even in the quiet of the night, the house felt different. The silence was heavy, charged, as if it were waiting for her next move, as if it were daring her to turn and face it. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not until she understood what it wanted. Days passed, and the unease in the house deepened. Vanessa could no longer ignore the weight of what had happened, nor could she pretend that it was nothing. Mark's refusal to acknowledge the strange occurrences in their home only pushed her further into herself. Every glance, every fleeting shadow that passed through the corner of her eye, became another piece of a puzzle she couldn't solve. She began to take long walks outside, searching for some semblance of normalcy. But every time she returned, the house greeted her with a quiet, insistent tension. It wasn't just the music anymore, the lingering scent, or the cold spots that crept through the halls. It was more. There was a sense of purpose in the house now, a sense that it had decided to reveal its secrets to her, piece by piece. One afternoon, while Mark was out meeting clients, Vanessa finally found the courage to go up to the attic. She had put it off for weeks, telling herself that it was simply an old room, nothing to be afraid of. But now, with her heart pounding in her chest, she knew she had no choice. If she was ever going to live in this house without the constant weight of fear pressing down on her, she had to face whatever lingered there. The stairs creaked under her weight as she ascended, each step a reminder of how much history was wrapped up in this place, in these walls. When she reached the top, she paused at the door. The cold spot from the hallway had followed her up here, and she shivered as she reached for the knob, turned easily in her hand. The attic was dark, the kind of dark that swallowed everything whole. But as she stepped inside, the air felt charged, alive. Vanessa hesitated for a moment, listening. But there was no sound, only the faint hum of silence pressing against her eardrums. She took another step forward, her feet falling softly onto the worn wooden floor. And then, the guitar. It was leaning against the far wall, right where she had seen it before, but now it was different. Now it felt more real, more present, as if it had been waiting for her all along. The strings were still, but the silence felt wrong. Vanessa stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes locked on the guitar. It was just a guitar, she told herself, an instrument, an object. But in the stillness of the attic, it felt alive, as if it were watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. The air around it was thick, pressing against her skin, and every part of her screamed for her to turn around, to run, to leave this place behind. But she couldn't. She couldn't walk away from it now. Slowly, hesitantly, she approached the guitar. Her fingertips brushed the strings. A soft, almost imperceptible hum vibrated through the wood. It wasn't a sound she had expected, not a melody, not a chord, but the faintest murmur of life, as if the guitar itself were stirring after years of silence. The cold spot in the room deepened, surrounding her like a living presence, and the world outside seemed to fade away. She was no longer aware of the walls or the attic's dusty corners. Her focus was solely on the instrument, on the strings that trembled beneath her touch. And then, from the far corner of the room, a shadow appeared. It wasn't a figure in the traditional sense, not a man or a woman or a recognizable shape, but something else. Presence. It moved slowly, almost imperceptibly, the edges of it blurring like a mirage. Vanessa's heart began to race. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and her breath came in quick, shallow gasps. The shadow shifted forward until it was right behind the guitar. She could feel the pull of it, the weight of its focus settling on her like a dark, oppressive blanket. It was Tito. She knew it without thinking, without questioning. It was as if the very soul of the house had bled through the walls and into the air, and she was there with him, as if he were standing beside her, playing his guitar again. The air hummed with the memory of his fingers strumming, of a song left unfinished. The house had kept his essence, his music, trapped within its walls, and now it had drawn her in, made her part of it. Vanessa swallowed, her throat dry as sand. She wanted to scream, to run, to break free from the suffocating presence surrounding her. But the guitar hummed again, louder this time, and her body betrayed her. Her hand moved of its own accord, reaching for the neck of the guitar, her fingers gently touching the strings. She expected them to be cold, stiff, and unused, but instead, they were warm, so much warmer than the room, than the house. And then the music began. It wasn't a song she knew, not something she had ever heard before, but it was beautiful, soft, and haunting, like the first light of dawn creeping through the darkness. The notes danced and fluttered, weaving together in a melody that felt ancient, timeless. The air seemed to tremble with it, vibrating under the weight of his presence, of the memory of his hands playing this very song long ago. Vanessa's heart ached, as if the music were tugging at something deep inside her, unraveling a thread she hadn't known was there. She closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her, feeling it settle into her bones, into her soul. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the music stopped. The guitar fell silent. The shadow in the corner of the room dissipated, fading back into the depths of the attic, leaving behind only the quiet hum of the house itself. The cold lifted, and for the first time in what felt like hours, Vanessa took a steady breath. She opened her eyes and looked around, but the room was empty once again. The guitar was still resting in its place, untouched. But now, there was something different about it, something more peaceful, as if the song had been completed, as if Tito had finally found the rest he had been seeking. She left the attic then, her footsteps slow and careful, as though she feared that the house would pull her back if she moved too quickly. When she reached the stairs, she glanced over her shoulder one last time. The door to the attic stood ajar, the shadows inside still and deep. But she knew that Tito had let go. The house was still a place of history, of music, and of memories. But now it was more than just a house. It was a sanctuary, a place where the past could rest, where the echoes of a life lived could fade into peace. The haunting had ended. Vanessa walked downstairs, feeling the weight lift from her chest. The air felt lighter now, the house no longer pressing against her in that suffocating way. She didn't know if she could ever truly explain what had happened, but in that moment, she didn't need to. She had shared the house with Tito Jackson, shared in his music, and in doing so, had given the house the one thing it had always wanted: recognition, closure, peace. And for the first time in months, she felt at home. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.